Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I am just admitting everyone from the waiting room. Hang on. We're just going to give it another second. Great. Okay. Well, it's 7:01, so let's just wait another minute and admit some people are, I can see them logging in. Okay. Okay, great.
Can you see me?
So so if you have your camera on, I can see you. I am going to have everyone muted, but you can unmute. So is that Wendy speaking? Now, Wendy, you're muted again. I can't hear her. Wendy, we can't hear you. You're muted, so you can unmute.
I just unmuted.
Okay, so we
And
can.
I said that my concern was I'm having a loud, messy dinner, and I didn't want
Oh,
to watch it. So
okay, so I want you to watch it, but I'm gonna turn off your you can turn off your video if you want to, but I'm gonna turn off your microphone.
okay.
Okay?
Mhm.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Eileen Matola, and I work for Haverford Township Recreation Department. I think you have a nice evening ahead of you because Ben Labowitz has done a number of, I guess, seminars. This is before everything had to be webinars in our facility at Haverford Reserve. It's the community center. We call it the CREC. So thanks for joining us. I'm going to introduce Ben. Ben is the owner of Wild Birds Unlimited, which is located in Manoa Shopping Center. If you haven't stopped in there, you definitely should. It's a great place to poke around. Plenty of presents you could buy people and buy for people. And I also think once you've listened to his webinar today, you're definitely going to want to pop in and get some food or something for the birds. There's a lot of great things there. And not only is Ben knowledgeable, his other employees are knowledgeable too. So it's a great place to check out. Let me just admit the last. Okay, I'm still admitting people from the waiting room, but we're doing well here. Okay. Let me just go over a few things. I am recording this. So if for some reason you can't stay for the whole evening, definitely email me tomorrow and I will email you the recording. If you have questions during it, you feel free to type your question in the chat box. Ben will kind of pay attention to that. If it's a good time, he might answer the question during his presentation, or else he can get to all the questions at the end. Sometimes people ask a question and he covers it, in the next paragraph. So, it'll all work out. You can also unmute yourself. So Ben is good with that too. So without further ado, Ben, the floor is yours.
All
Enjoy,
right.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. Thank you. Thank you. And good evening, everybody. This is the first time I've given one of these on Zoom, so this is a new experience for me, but I'm excited about it. Yeah, my name is Ben Labowitz, and as Eileen mentioned, I own Wild Birds Unlimited in the Manoa Shopping Center. We just celebrated our third anniversary, so we're 3 years old. I've been feeding birds for about 8 years. I am not an ornithologist. But I've gotten pretty good with just knowing about bird feeding and which birds eat what and all kinds of things about bird feeding. So hopefully if you have any questions, I'll be able to answer them. And if I don't, I can look them up and get back to you. So this should take about an hour, I guess, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. I'm not sure. We'll see how it goes. So So thank you. So this is a deck that I can't take credit for. It was put together by an organization called Operation Feeder Watch. I tweaked it a little bit, but I want to give them credit. And what is Project Feeder Watch? And many of you or some of you may know already, but it's basically a project where people can look outside and count birds. So maybe they have a feeder somewhere and they count the birds that they see for a given time period. And really all you need to know is what birds or how many birds you see. And you do need to know what kind of birds they are. So sometimes people just have like a bird guidebook with them while they're watching, but you can do it for a half hour. You can do it for an hour. And then the idea is then you report this data, what you've seen, back to Project Feeder Watch, and they use this information for a lot of great things. It really helps them learn about birds and how many birds are around and which species are growing, which species are declining, and where everybody has been seen. It's done during the winter. Was sort of started by Cornell University. They have a big ornithology program. And it's actually this year it's through April 9th. So if you haven't done it yet and you want to start, you can start. You can do it once, you can do it twice, you can do it as many times as you want. But it's basically every year. It's from roughly November through the end of March is basically when it's done. And it helps scientists track trends in bird distribution and abundance. I guess they call this citizen science, where anybody can help the scientists learn about a topic. All skill levels and backgrounds. Just like I said, all you need to know is you do need to know what kind of bird you're looking at. But other than that, there's not too much to it. If you want any more information about it, just go to www.feederwatch.org. There is a nominal fee to participate, but you get a lot of neat things for that. You get a handbook, you get an ID poster, calendar, things like that. So it's a really great program. So basically the data from Project Feeder Watch and the folks that work at Project Feeder Watch put together this presentation. So what are we going to be talking about tonight? So first, a few facts about backyard bird feeding. Then why feed birds? Different foods to offer, different feeder options. There's a little section called Baffling Squirrels. A lot of people want to try and keep squirrels away from their bird feeder. Not everybody though. Some of my customers, for instance, are just as happy with birds eating the bird food as the squirrels eating the bird food as birds. But most people want to keep the squirrels away. How do we create a bird-friendly habitat? How do we keep our birds safe, the birds that come to our feeders? We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then there's a little bit at the end I have here there was a study that came out about a year ago about bird decline. So we'll touch on that a little bit. And then we'll finish off with just going over the top 20 birds in Pennsylvania that visit a feeder. If anybody has any questions as I'm going along, feel free to chime in or raise your hand, what have you. I'll try and answer your questions. So first of all, some facts and figures about backyard bird feeding. So when people think of birders, I think they usually think of the folks that have their binoculars out and that are maybe traveling around the country or maybe traveling around the world. And those are definitely birders. But that the term birders also includes people who are just simply looking out their window into their backyard. These people are known as backyard birders, and really close to 9 out of 10 birders are in fact backyard birders. So the large majority of people that consider themselves birders are just looking at the birds around their house. What about male versus female? Well, on average, slightly more birders are female than male. And actually, I've noticed that at my store as well. I've never analyzed the numbers, but I feel like I do have a little bit more than 50% of the people that come into the store are female versus male. No real reason or theories why, but that just seems to be what it is. There's also the stereotype is that people that watch birds are a little bit older, and to some extent that's true. Actually, as you look at the different age ranges, as you get older, a higher and higher percentage of those people do actually watch birds. But recently, these numbers have started to change a little bit in that more young people are getting into bird watching. Still a smaller percentage relative compared to the sort of older generation, but it has been growing amongst younger people as well. And there's been a lot of articles over the last year during the pandemic that a lot of people have gotten into birding that weren't doing it before, as they were looking for some new activities to do. Overall, over 50 million Americans feed birds. Now we'll talk specifically about people who feed birds, not just watch birds. So over 50 million, it's a big number. The bird feeding industry is a $7 billion industry, which makes it actually the second largest outdoor hobby behind gardening. Now it is a distant second. Gardening, I believe the last I checked, was about a $37 billion industry. But number two, in terms of outdoor hobbies, is bird feeding. And over 1 million tons of seed are fed to birds every year. It's called supplemental feeding, we call it. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But 1 million tons is the same thing as 2 billion pounds. So it's a lot of bird food is being purchased.
Ben, can I just interrupt for 1 second?
Sure.
Some people say that your slideshow's a little small, and Gretchen is telling me in the upper right-hand corner of your slideshow window, there's an underline, a couple document, and an X. If he clicks the double document, it will make your show go full screen.
Okay, let's see.
See.
Sorry about that, everybody.
Well, mine's 3/4 of the screen.
Okay, give me a minute here.
Let's just.
It took a double click for me. This is Wendy.
Okay.
Let's see.
It's at the top, that little tiny double, at the very top of at the top right here.
Top right. Okay.
That little double, I think it's that little double, that icon.
This.
No, further up, higher up. Higher up. See those little,
All the way up, higher. To the right there.
on the right.
Right
All
there.
together.
There you go.
Yeah, over there, Ben. So it's the double box.
Yeah, near the X on the right. Up.
Oh,
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
That. No? Oh, thought that would do it.
Let me see. Just trying to go full. I wonder. Oh, well, I wonder. How about
What
this?
can't you see the?
Is that
you can't
better?
see- No.
No? Okay.
See,
No,
that's better. Okay.
See, I think that Eileen and I are saying one thing and you guys are saying something else.
Yeah,
Oh,
because we're the
that's
hosts.
Right. Let's see.
Actually, I'm looking, I just made my husband send me a picture. It isn't, I don't know if everyone's in agreement. I can see it well. I made him send me a picture of his screen.
I can see it clearly.
Okay, I
mean,
think we
it's
should,
clear. It's just a little bit teeny small, the type, but that's it. It's very visible.
okay, all right. I think then
Yeah.
we should carry on. Okay, Ben.
Okay. All right. All right.
Okay, thanks, Ben.
Okay. Sure. Sure. Okay. So why feed the birds? So let me ask a question. This will be one where when I give this presentation in person, I do ask a fair number of questions. I'm going to try and ask fewer questions with this Zoom one because I think it's a little bit more difficult this way, but let's try this one. Do wild birds rely upon feeder food?
Yes.
We got a yes. Anybody else? Anybody disagree? So the answer,
Wendy, yes.
the answer actually is no. They don't rely upon feeder food. Let's say generally, the estimates are that when feeders are present throughout the year, still 85 to 90% of a bird's diet is still from natural sources of food. That's when feeders are around. Now, to the person who said yes, you know what? I guess maybe it's a little bit of a trick question. There are times of the year where they really do, where the supplemental feeding really, really does help. Like the time a couple weeks ago that we just got out of with snow on the ground. When
Mhm.
there's snow on the ground, it really makes it a lot more difficult for the birds to find some of their natural food. So times like that number that I said, the 85 to 90% being natural food, that number goes down a lot when there's snow on the ground, for instance. So there are times of the year where the feeder food is particularly useful. But in general, this is all supplemental feeding. The birds can, they're going to they still find sources of natural food. But then they'll supplement it with some feeder food. And then now there has been some research. Now it's very limited. There hasn't been frankly, a lot of research done on this topic about this supplemental feeding. Is this good for birds? So there's not, full disclosure, there's not a ton of research that's been done. However, there has been some research done, and it finds that it is good for birds. Birds that use feeders are typically healthier than birds without access to feeders. I won't go into all these scientific reasons, increased antioxidant levels, such, et cetera, has been found. Now, full disclosure, this particular study that I'm looking at was funded by a bird feeding organization. So, but that doesn't mean that it's not accurate. It has been done, and it was scientifically done, where they looked at a test and control group, what have you, and they found that the birds that had access to food did seem to be generally healthier than birds that didn't. And then another question that sometimes comes up, and some of my customers ask me this sometimes: if we start feeding birds, do they grow to rely on it? And then does that mean we have to feed birds for the rest of our life? Or if we stop feeding birds, will the birds have grown to rely on it? And that is not true either. There has been research done on that, where they put feeders up and then took feeders down, and the birds were in the group where they took the feeders down, the birds did not have any adverse, there was no adverse results to the birds after the feeders were taken down. So birds don't grow reliant on the feeders. That meshes with what I mentioned to you before, how this is just supplemental feeding, where they get most of their food from natural sources anyway. There's also one other study, which I'm not even going to show up here, done by Audubon, which looked at birds that visit feeders versus species of birds that don't visit feeders, because not all species actually, some species don't visit feeders. And what they found was that over time, the birds that species that visit feeders seem to be growing a little bit faster than the birds that don't visit feeders, or not declining as quickly as the bird species that don't visit feeders. So overall, there's a number of studies that show that bird feeding is overall pretty good for the birds. So going back to the thing I said a moment ago, though, if birds don't need the food really that we provide at feeders, why should we feed them? Any thoughts on that? Nancy?
I love looking at them. That's for me. I love looking at them.
Mm-hmm.
And I save my food for this. I love it when it snows, because I just real quickly, even when it doesn't snow and it's cold, I'm sitting here with two computers and I'm staring out back, and I throw peanuts, and all I do is see a gazillion blue jays.
Yeah.
And I love it. That's why I feed them.
Yeah. Hey, you know what? You're spot on. That's one of the answers. So yeah, I mean, it's fun and interesting. Who can resist watching the antics of a chickadee or a goldfinch or a cardinal, the colors of a goldfinch and a cardinal, especially against the backdrop of snow, the red of a cardinal with the back, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And it's just a way to connect with nature. So it's just and we know that connecting with nature is healthy. There's been a lot of research done on that. Bird watching is healthy. Connecting with nature is healthy. There's multiple studies. One from England last year found that people living in neighborhoods with more birds and tree cover suffer less depression, anxiety, and stress. Another study found that just listening to the songs of birds contributes to stress recovery. And then just in general, just studies about being out in nature is just sustained exposure to nature has been found to be healthy. So bird watching is healthy, fun and healthy. Now, having said that, are there any potential negative impacts from this supplemental feeding? I'll open this one up to anybody. Let's hear if anybody has any thoughts on that. Nancy? Oh, and by the way, I'm
I'm
sorry,
not shy.
I only see a limited number of
Right,
names on my
faces.
screen.
Yeah.
Nancy happens to be right near the top.
Right,
So if anybody else was raising their hands, I didn't see
I
it.
live in a condo, HOA, and they don't want, I haven't gotten, but mice and things like that. I have seen droppings from larger animals out back, but they're probably, I mean, I see fox and things out back anyway, but they're about the mice. They're worried about the mice. with the
Okay,
snakes.
okay.
That's legit.
This is Wendy, if I'm being heard.
Yep, you are.
You are.
Okay. The small birds occasionally get eaten by the, I don't want to call them eagles,
Hawk.
Hmm?
Hawks.
hawks, yes.
Yeah.
Of course, some of the squirrels have gotten picked up by hawks. But when that happens, going, well, I'm also feeding a bird, a hawk. Just don't like to see my little friends killed, but that's kind of an up down.
Mhm, mhm.
It's also a way to get a good cat collection in your yards.
Well, that too. There's a cat garage, I call the one bush. I have the one feeder set far enough away that even the best ones who fly up and out can't quite get there. But I've seen some amazing flying cats over the years. So
Right.
It's good to sit out with the hose in the summertime. So if the cats come, you squirt them with the hose. It doesn't hurt them, but they go away.
Right.
They don't like
I love cats too. So
birds like wet cats. So.
Right. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about cats will come up a little bit later in the presentation as well. So yeah. Well, listen, those are all good answers. And some of them I'm going to cover, and few of them you mentioned, a few of them maybe you didn't. So one is there is the potential for disease transmission from unclean feeders. To tell you the truth, right now, I just read it just in the last couple of days, I read I think it's South Carolina, but don't quote me on that. I'm going off memory. I think there's been some evidence that potentially there's some salmonella issues going on with some finches there. And while I don't know if they have any proof of this, there's the potential that maybe there's some of that being spread by some bird feeders. So we'll get into some of the ways to keep that from happening. But yeah, there is the potential for disease transmission. Window strikes. So sometimes birds will be startled and fly away from a feeder, be startled for one of many reasons and fly right into a window, for instance, or into a house. But there's things that we can do to help limit that as well. We'll talk a little bit about that soon. And then this one was mentioned, increased predation pressures, like for instance, hawks feeding on feeder birds. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But yeah, so there are, it's not all rosy news. There can be some negative impacts, but again, these are all things that we can limit. There's methods we can take, actions we can take, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So next, I want to talk a little bit about what foods that birds like to eat, feeder birds like to eat. And by the way, I should mention, not all birds, I might have mentioned this before, not all birds visit feeders. Some birds will never visit a bird feeder, but there are some that, there are many that do. So for the ones that do, what are some of the foods that are the best foods to offer? And bread is not one of them. Bread is not really nutritious for them. So the first one is black oil sunflower. This is any blend that you see somewhere that it's, that's decent will have its first ingredient or at least one of its main ingredients will be black oil sunflower. Very nutritious. And this is, if you were to just pick one ingredient, this is the one that attracts the widest variety of birds, either in the shell or out of the shell. Peanuts. This is one that sometimes people come to my store and if they're new to bird feeding, they're surprised that peanuts is something that birds like. And plenty of birds love peanuts. Woodpeckers and chickadees and nuthatches. There's a lot of birds like peanuts. Either in the shell or out of the shell. Some birds prefer them one way or the other, but either way, that's very popular food and nutritious and high in fat. Suet. So suet is rendered beef fat. This particular picture of suet, which is a little bit of an unusual looking picture of it, but this is a suet blend. And most of the time when people are buying suet to put in a suet feeder, they're buying a suet blend. You can feed straight suet. Woodpeckers love straight suet, but most of the time, the ones that you'll see available are suet mixed with peanuts or suet mixed with seeds or something like that. Very high in fat. Some people only feed suet in the winter. It can melt when the temperature is above 90 degrees. So some people don't do it in the summer, but there are no melt suets available. They just have a little less suet and a little bit more of the other things that they're blended with, so they don't really melt. But suet can be fed all year round. And again, woodpeckers are the number one bird you'll see a suet feeder. But the rule of thumb is that any species of bird that likes insects will also like suet. Safflower. So safflower is very popular. Safflower is an interesting seed in that people buy safflower to feed to their birds, often for as much for what it doesn't attract as for what it does attract. The reason I'm saying that is there are some birds that some people consider nuisance birds. A lot of birds in the blackbird family, which include grackles and starlings. Some people love them, but a lot of people consider them a little bit of a nuisance. They'll come in a large flock. They'll sometimes scare away some of the smaller birds, and they'll eat a lot. So safflower is actually a seed that they don't like. Starlings and grackles, their shape of their beak, they have trouble cracking open safflower seeds. But plenty of birds like safflower, like plenty of more quote unquote desirable birds. Cardinals love safflower, nuthatches, chickadees like safflower. So it's a little more limited in what it attracts compared to sunflower, for instance, but some of the birds that it doesn't attract are some birds that people don't want to see at their feeder. And also squirrels, by the way, don't typically like safflower either. It has a bit of a bitter taste that doesn't agree with them. And Niger seed, a lot of people call this thistle, but we call it Niger seed. It's imported from Southeast Asia, and it's actually not technically thistle, but it looks like thistle. So that's why a lot of people call it thistle. The number one reason that a lot of people feed Niger seed is to attract goldfinches. The yellow birds, well, the males are yellow in the spring and the summer. They're really unique looking. You don't use, first time I ever saw one, I thought it was a pet bird that had escaped from somebody's house. Beautiful bird. In the fall and the winter, the male is sort of an olive color, but in the spring and summer, it starts to turn in spring, and in the summer, it's bright yellow. And they love Niger seed. They also like sunflower seed. Other foods to offer. Now, these next couple that I'm going to mention are really just for ground feeding. So cracked corn and millet. So these are both good foods. They're a little bit more limited in the number of birds that eat them, but they're really for birds that are mainly feeding on the ground, like mourning doves and like sparrows. They both really like cracked corn and millet, for example. If you're ever buying a blend to put in your feeders, don't buy one that has an overwhelming amount of millet or cracked corn in it, just because there's a lot of birds that will visit the feeder that aren't as interested in these foods. These are not considered filler, though. They're definitely good quality bird foods, but they're really just mainly for ground feeding birds. Now, what to avoid? If you ever are in a supermarket or a hardware store and you see a seed blend that looks something like this, avoid it. There's something called Milo. It's also known as sorghum. It's a cereal. And it's that, in the picture, if you can see it, it's that kind of like orange brown looking seed or food that you see in there. very, very, very few birds like it. Typically, even in these, in a bad blend, there may be some sunflower in it that the bird wants. So they'll just push out the stuff that they don't like to get to what they want. And typically you'll see a lot of this laying on the ground uneaten under the feeder. So avoid something that includes Milo. It's really, really cheap. So the blend may be really cheap, but in this case, you get what you pay for. Okay. Other foods though, let's flip back to foods that are actually good for the birds, nutritious, and that a lot of birds will like. So fruit or jelly, for instance, so like Baltimore Orioles, for instance, which are typically only here in our area in the summer, but they're beautiful, bright orange. They really like fruit. They also like nectar. And there's other fruit loving birds also. I mean, robins like fruit, as I'm sure most of you know, and mockingbirds and catbirds. So there's a lot of birds that like fruit. Mealworms. So there's a picture here of an American kestrel, but the number one bird, when people buy mealworms at my store, for instance, they're often looking to attract bluebirds. So bluebirds are beautiful birds, not blue jays. Blue jays are beautiful also, but bluebirds, that one of their favorite foods are mealworms. I've never seen a bluebird at my feeder at home, just because I don't have they like a big open area, and I don't really have a big open area in my backyard. So not every yard will attract them. But if you can get bluebirds, they're really, really, really beautiful. And they like other things too, but mealworms is high on their list. Any insect-eating birds will eat mealworms. So, nuthatches and titmice, a lot of good birds will eat a lot of other cool birds will eat mealworms as well, either live or dried. They love them in particular live, but they'll also eat them dried. All right, so that's a little bit about some of the main types of food that people feed their birds. Next, let's talk a little bit about feeders. And are there any questions about foods? Sorry, I don't want to be going through this too quickly. Anybody? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about feeders. A lot of different types of feeders.
How about sparrows? They're very aggressive. Sometimes we just have a giant flock of sparrows and they're so aggressive, they just push all the other birds out. Anything to do about that?
That's a tough one. But yeah, I get that question a lot. So there's some things you can do a little bit about it, but it'll really just sort of maybe lessen them a little bit, but you're never going to totally eliminate them because they like a lot of different foods. So one thing you want to do is not use any blend that has millet or cracked corn in it. So even though they'll eat other foods too, they really love millet, for instance. So avoid any millet in a blend. So that may help limit them a little bit. They also, in my experience, I mean, I don't really see them go to a suet feeder, for instance. So you can feed suet, and I don't think you're going to get many sparrows going to that. At least that's been my experience. They're naturally ground feeders. So, all things being equal, they'll stay on the ground. They'll go up to a feeder too, but they're naturally like to be on the ground. What some people do is they actually use the diversion tactic where they'll put another feeder far away from the feeder that they're really planning to watch. So maybe put another feeder at the other end of the yard and put a lot of millet in it or put some cheap food in it or something like that, that maybe will attract one of my customers actually the other day just told me this, that she's had a lot of success with that. She said they all go to this other feeder that she doesn't really see. And then if they leave they for the most part leave the number one feeder alone. So you might want to try something like that as well. But they're not that easy. It's a frustrating topic. All right. So some feeder options. So some of this slide is fairly obvious, but you don't want a feeder. You want to get a good feeder. You don't want one that has any sharp edges or sharp corners. You want something that's easy to clean. They're not all easy to clean. Some are a little easier than others. Something sturdy, obviously. I mean, there's definitely wear and tear that happens to a feeder over the years, especially if a squirrel gets on them. So you want them to be as sturdy as possible and easy to fill. If it's not easy to fill, you're going to be less likely to want to go out and fill it, and so that seems kind of obvious too. So what are the different types of feeders? So this type is called a hopper feeder. This is kind of the classic bird feeder. It looks like a birdhouse a little bit. And every feeder, by the way, has pros and cons. So one of the pros for the hopper feeder is it's easy for most birds to use. Most birds will land on a hopper feeder and be able to eat out of a hopper feeder very easily. So that's a pro. A con, though, is maybe there's some birds that you don't want to see as often on your feeder. So maybe you want to limit it a little bit. And a hopper feeder usually doesn't limit things because it's very easy for most birds. Another con for a hopper feeder is that it's very open to the elements. So if there's a lot of rain, for instance, it's not very well covered. I mean, it's a little bit covered, but it's fairly open. If the rain is coming at any sort of angle, the food can get pretty wet. Usually a good hopper feeder, though, has some drainage areas on it so that any water that comes in will pour out as well. But anyway, hopper feeders is a great choice, very popular choice. Sort of similar to a hopper feeder is a tray feeder. Some people call them a platform feeder. It's very open, as you can see. Similarly to a hopper feeder, virtually every bird that, any bird can use it. Like, for instance, this bird's not in this picture, but mourning doves. For those of you that know mourning doves, they're kind of big and lumbering, very common in the area. They have trouble landing on most feeders because they're just a little cumbersome. But a mourning dove can land very easily on a feeder like this. But then again, you may not want mourning doves at your feeder. So that may be a negative for a feeder like this because it's easy for just about all birds. One of the negatives also for this is this type of feeder is obviously very open to the elements. A lot of times when people buy a feeder like this, they buy some kind of a roof that can go over it to help keep it dry, but it's sort of like an umbrella that goes over it. And then any good tray or platform feeder should have drainage holes in it, so any rain that comes down will fall through the holes as well. Okay. Another kind of feeder, nectar feeders. It just occurred to me that in the section before about foods, we didn't include nectar. So we'll talk about it a little bit here. So this is really for people, mainly for people who want to attract hummingbirds. And hummingbirds are in the area here from, say, late April to late September or early October for the most part. Sometimes I hear stories sometimes about a hummingbird that's been seen in the winter. So that's not that uncommon, but generally they migrate here and they're here for the warm weather. And then when it gets cold, they leave, they get out of town. But hummingbirds like nectar. It's just important to keep the nectar. The most important thing is to keep the nectar fresh. I think sometimes people put the nectar out and they leave it out and out and out and out. You have to change it on average every 3 to 5 days. But in the real heat, especially if your feeder is in the direct sunlight, sometimes some of the books say that you should change the nectar every day. Because when it goes bad, the hummingbirds will not want it, and then they potentially will, not come back. Even if they were coming to it for a while, but once it goes bad, they may not want to come back. So you want to keep that fresh. Also, orioles like nectar as well. For the most part, from what I understand, and I don't see orioles too often, but I think they seem to go to fruit a little bit more easily than nectar, but they're known to drink nectar as well. Tube feeders. So this is a very popular, I'd say this might be the most popular type of feeder. Maybe hopper feeders are, but these are right up there. And they have perches on them. So the birds land on the perch and eat through the portholes. Again, with the pros and cons of a tube feeder, one of the pros is that it's pretty well covered from rain. There's just these little portholes. I mean, I'm not saying that no rain will get in, but not as much as some of the other feeders that we talked about before. So that's a good thing, because if bird food gets wet and it stays wet, it can go bad. Now, if you have good quality food, usually it gets eaten before it has a chance to go bad. But in any event, you never want the food to get too wet. So that's one of the pros of the tube feeders. It's very, it keeps the elements out. One of the cons is that some birds have a little trouble using the perches. So for instance, then the example I usually give for this is cardinals. Now, I've seen cardinals on my tube feeder, so it's not impossible, but they sometimes do it with a little bit of difficulty. They flutter their wings a little bit to steady themselves while they're on it. Cardinals, and everybody loves to see cardinals, Cardinals are naturally ground feeders, so they'll go up to a feeder, but all things equal, they'll stay on the ground. But when they are on a feeder, they like something a little bit flatter. That's just kind of, it's just a little bit easier for them to use. So like a tray feeder or a hopper feeder is a little bit easier for them than a tube feeder. But tube feeders are very popular. Plenty of people use them. It's the first feeder I ever had was a tube feeder. By the way, this picture of the Junco on the left on that feeder that's kind of rare. Juncos are usually only hanging out on the ground. You see them at a feeder once in a while, but not usually. All right, a Niger feeder. So a Niger feeder, the one thing I didn't mention about Niger before when I was talking about the different foods is that it's very, very tiny. It's like the smallest. Milla is probably the smallest seed, but Niger's right up there. Niger's very small also. So Niger will usually, a lot of people will put it in a tube feeder, but it's a special tube feeder. It's a tube feeder that has a very, very small porthole, smaller than the portholes that I showed you on this previous picture. So if you see those portholes, just much smaller than that, you can't really see it on this picture, but if the porthole is too big, the Niger will just kind of fall out of the feeder. So, but yeah, so tube feeders are very common. And also this thing called a Niger sock or a goldfinch sock. It looks like a sock and it has very, very tiny little holes in it. It's like mesh. And birds will land right on it. The goldfinches, for instance, will land right on it and cling to it, and they'll be able to get the Niger seed out of it. And it's a very inexpensive feeder. You can get a Niger sock is, $5 or $6, something like that. The only negative with the sock is it's not as sturdy. If a squirrel lands on it, for instance, they can chew a hole in it pretty quickly. And it's also very open to the elements. So that's a little bit about Niger feeders. Suet feeders. We talked a little bit about suet before, which is, again, it's rendered beef fat. And a suet feeder can be something as simple. This is the classic one on the left. It's just a little cage that you drop a suet cake in. And that's a woodpecker, lands right on it and just kind of goes to town. Some people also make their own suet. I've never tried that, but I know some people do that sometimes, and it usually looks something like that on the right-hand side. There's also more elaborate suet feeders, but this is all. I mean, you can either use a cage or something a little bit bigger, a little sturdier, maybe. Okay. Another nice thing about suet, by the way, is sometimes some birds that you don't typically see at a bird feeder will go to a suet feeder. So as an example, some warblers, which you don't usually see at a feeder, but they are kind of interested in, and they'll go to suet certain times of the year. Peanut feeders. We talked a little bit about peanuts before. Some birds will eat peanuts either out of the shell or in the shell. Here on the left is an example, and blue jays like it in particular. They'll eat it out of the shell too, but they also really like it in the shell. They'll typically grab the whole thing, the whole peanut, like this blue jay is doing right here, and fly away with it and cache it or store it someplace for future use. Other birds, though, like for instance, chickadees and nuthatches, will peck away at the shell and extract the peanut from within. So if you have I use this feeder at home, and a lot of times after it's been out for a while, I'll look inside and I'll see a lot of shells with little holes in them. So a lot of empty shells will be in there. And then, like I said, on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see plenty of birds like to eat peanuts out of the shell as well. Peanuts out of the shell can start to, if they get rained on a lot, if they're out too long, they can start to go bad. So you don't want to put too many out, just enough for the birds to be able to eat without it staying out for too long. That nuthatch on the right is a very interesting bird. They like to hang upside down a lot, so they're kind of fun to watch. And then some people make their own, you don't need to buy one. I mean, I like it when you buy it at my store, a feeder, but you don't have to. You can make it out of a hubcap or a log. Some people just sort of like make holes in a log, and they kind of stuff suet inside those holes. That's a pileated woodpecker on the right. Beautiful bird. That's the woody woodpecker. I don't see those too often, but they're around. They kind of look like a little dinosaur. They look prehistoric. They're the biggest woodpecker. All right, so that's a little bit about different feeders. Any questions on that section? Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about squirrels. Just seeing how we are for time. Okay, 7:45. So squirrels, most people, if I had a dime for every time someone came into my store, you know, complaining about squirrels, I'd have a lot of dimes basically. Having said that, some people don't mind them. So I get some customers that say, oh, you know, they need to eat also, you know, I don't mind. But for the most part, you know, people, even the people who like squirrels, for the most part, don't want them to eat too much of their bird food, because squirrels can eat a lot of it in a short period of time. And also when a squirrel's at the feeder, they're kind of pushing out. There's no room for the birds to be at the feeder. So generally people want to keep the squirrels away. So there's several ways to do that. So one of the classic ways is using what's called a baffle. So there's generally two different types of baffles. The one on the right-hand side, I know this picture isn't the greatest picture, but is the classic baffle. So it's sort of like a cone-shaped thing, I would say, that goes around the pole. And it serves as a barrier. So when a squirrel is climbing up the pole, they just can't get around it. It just stops them in their tracks. And these work really, really well. I have baffles on my 2 bird feeding poles, and I have never, ever seen a squirrel get to my bird feeders. Having said that, there's a couple of caveats. Squirrels, baffles only work, this type of baffle only works if squirrels' only route to the feeder is up the pole. Squirrels can jump up to 10 feet, 8 to 10 feet, say, horizontally. So if the pole is within 8 to 10 feet of a tree or a fence or anything that the squirrel could jump from, the squirrel could jump straight from the fence or the tree straight to the feeder. In that case, the baffle doesn't do you any good. That's why I said the baffle only works if the squirrel's only route to the feeder is up the pole. Not everybody has a yard a big enough yard where they can put a baffle, where they can put a pole where there will be at least 10 feet in any direction around the pole. And also you want your feeder to be the most important rule is you want it to be somewhere where you can see it easily. So there might not be a spot where you can see it easily and it's going to be 10 feet away from things. So it doesn't work for everybody, but baffles work great under the right conditions. Also, baffles have to be at least 3.5 to 4 feet off the ground. If they're too low, the squirrel could just jump right to the top of them. Squirrels can jump up to 4 feet high. So that's that type of baffle. On the left is another type of baffle. These are baffles that are above the feeders. This is for the situation where a squirrel is jumping from above. Maybe there's a tree above the feeder and they're jumping from above. When there's a baffle above the feeder, it just makes it very difficult for the squirrel to stick the landing. Let's say they jump onto the top of this baffle and they fall off. So these are very effective as well if you're getting squirrels jumping from above. So that's a little bit about baffles. Another way to keep squirrels away from feeders are squirrel-proof feeders. Now, this is not a good picture of a squirrel-proof feeder, so I apologize for that. But as the way a squirrel-proof feeder works is it's weight activated. So since squirrels weigh a lot more than birds, so when a squirrel gets on one of these feeders, this like metal part around the feeder shifts down. The weight of the squirrel shifts it down and blocks, the screen basically blocks access to the portholes on the feeder. So the weight of the squirrel will get on here, it weighs down the cage that's around the feeder, and then the squirrel can't get to the porthole to where the food is. But when a bird lands on it, they weigh so much less that the screen does not move and the birds are still able to get to the porthole. So it's not a great picture of a squirrel-proof feeder, but these are very effective. They work really well. The only caveat here is that the squirrel has to get on the feeder for it to be activated, for it to shut. If these feeders are hanging someplace so close to like a tree, for instance, that the squirrel could hold onto the tree, keep its weight on the tree and reach over and stick his or her hand into the porthole, then it doesn't work. But it just has to be, there just has to be some clearance so that in order that the squirrel can't reach over without putting his or her weight on it. Sometimes what looks like a squirrel-proof feeder is not a squirrel-proof feeder. So these may seemingly look like a squirrel-proof feeder, but these holes are way too wide. So the squirrel was able to squeeze through and get to the food. So these are not squirrel-proof feeders. They look nice, but they're not squirrel-proof. Some people, just like I mentioned before, in answer to that question about how to keep sparrows away, where I said, well, maybe put a feeder out with foods that they particularly like that's well away from the feeder that you're looking at, and you can divert the sparrow's attention. Well, the same type of thing can be done with squirrels. So sometimes people, and I sell them in my store, we sell squirrel feeders. Some people put a squirrel feeder up. Some people put a squirrel feeder up because they just like watching the squirrels eat. But then some people also do it because they want to give the squirrels something so that they won't bother their bird feeder. The squirrels like corn like this, or there's other kinds of squirrel food that they'll eat as well. Hot pepper. So for those of you that don't know this already, the interesting thing about capsaicin, which is the ingredient in hot pepper that makes it hot, the interesting thing about it is that it only mammals feel the heat from hot pepper. Birds do not. So we feel the heat from hot pepper. Squirrels feel the heat from hot pepper, but birds do not. So typically, when a squirrel tries some food that has hot pepper in it, typically they won't like it and they won't want to come back. Now, nature's unpredictable, so I don't guarantee that a squirrel is never going to eat it, because I have seen squirrels nibble at food with hot pepper in it. But I would say at the very least, it at least limits the amount they eat. They will eat less of it than they would if it didn't have hot pepper, if not eat it at all. And by the way, there's no harm that comes to the squirrel. It's purely hot and sort of an unpleasant experience for him or her. Oh, and by the way, this doesn't mean just to sprinkle a little hot pepper into your bird food. That doesn't really work. It really has to be really coated. There's some bird food that's already made with hot pepper on it. There's also like a liquid that's made for a hot pepper liquid that's made for mixing with bird food that really coats it. So you really want to, it really needs to be coated with it. A little bit of it is not really going to work so well. So those are all ways to help keep squirrels at bay. But other than squirrels, there are sometimes other animals that visit a bird feeder too. The number one being a raccoon. We actually sell raccoon baffles as well as squirrel baffles, and a raccoon baffle is just a bigger squirrel baffle. Because raccoons can typically get around a regular squirrel baffle, but they typically can't get around a raccoon baffle. But they really, a lot of times people, if somebody finds their bird feeder on the ground in the morning, a lot of times it's a raccoon that got to it overnight. You know, foxes like bird food, pine martens like bird food. So there's a lot of, you know, deer like a lot of bird food. So there's other feeder visitors as well. Moose, bear. So generally people that live in bear country up north don't feed birds because it's inevitable that the bird feeder is going to get damaged. All right. So that was a little bit about keeping squirrels away, and then a little bit about some other animals that like bird food as well. The next thing is bird-friendly habitats. So, you know, putting a bird feeder out is great, but if you really want to get a lot of birds, well, you don't need a bird feeder, but you know, it's nice to have a bird feeder because you can kind of look at it and see the birds on it. But there's other ways to attract birds to your yard as well. The key thing, or to attract birds and to make your yard bird friendly, the key three pieces of this equation are shelter, natural sources of food, and water. So what do we mean by shelter? Well, that could mean something like a brush pile, just kind of, you know, like in this picture. Birds will feel comfortable if they have a little spot to fly away to or scurry away to in case there's any danger. So you can have a feeder, and near your feeder, you can have something like this, maybe not this elaborate, but just, you know, a lot of times people put feeders kind of near some bushes or things like that. And a lot of times you'll see the birds in the bushes, then they'll jump out to the feeder, then they'll go back, you know, they'll eat a little bit, they'll go back to the bush, for instance. So some type of shelter is very helpful. And this also included under the shelter umbrella is birdhouses or nesting boxes. Here's an example of a bluebird box. Not all birds will go to a box, but plenty do. And bluebirds is an example of a species that was actually on the decline. But a lot of folks started to put up bluebird houses, and they started to get used, and the bluebird population, which had been declining, stabilized and then actually started to grow. So bluebird, and then some people put bluebird houses out a lot of times in the summer, or sorry, in the spring, and you'll see birds make nests and raise their young. That's really exciting. But also in the winter, sometimes people put up what's called a roosting box, which is similar to a nesting box, just slightly different, but it's mainly there for shelter. So shelter from the cold. So those will be used as well. Natural sources of food. So native plants, very important. We talked before about how 85 to 90% of a bird's diet is going to be natural sources of food, even when a feeder's around. So you want to have some natural sources of food around. And I'm not an expert on this, but you can't go wrong with natural food sources. And water. Source of water is an often overlooked but great way to attract birds. And some birds, for instance, cedar waxwings, which are a beautiful bird, don't really go to a bird feeder, but they will go to a bird bath. So it's a nice way to not only help a lot of the birds that you may already be seeing at your feeder, adding a bird bath, but even you may see some birds that you don't normally see at your feeder because of the water. In the summer, sometimes people are worried about mosquitoes. So it is a good idea to have something in your bird bath that'll move the water. We sell something at the store called a water wiggler. It keeps the water moving, and that keeps mosquitoes from laying eggs. And also moving water is a little bit more attractive to birds. And birds will use the water to either drink and or bathe themselves. All right, keeping birds safe. I know it's already close to 8. I'm going to try and pick up the pace a little bit. We don't have too much more. But keeping birds safe. One of the things when I first started bird feeding 8 years ago, I remember reading in a book that says, well, when you feed birds, it's your responsibility to do the best you can to keep the birds safe. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm feeding the birds. What more? That's a really good thing. What more do I have to do? But when you think about it, you are in a way you're attracting birds to your yard. So you want to make sure you're not doing it in a way that can put them in any danger or limit the amount of danger they can get in. So and we talked about this a little bit earlier in the talk. Some of the things we're talking about keeping birds, some of the things that can cause harm to birds. We're talking about predators, cats, disease, windows. So we'll cover each of these very quickly. So predators, typically we're talking hawks. Red-tailed hawks are very common in the area. Cooper's hawks, very common in the area. And unfortunately, if you feed birds long enough, you're usually going to see, at least if not see it actually happen, you may see evidence of a hawk strike. You might see some feathers on the ground. If you're getting, so one thing is to put your bird feeder in a place where birds can get to shelter quickly. That's one helpful way, to make them feel a little safer and be a little safer. If you are noticing some hawk strikes, there are some hawks getting to some of the birds on your feeder. One thing that some people do is take the food down for 3 to 5 days, something like that, and then you won't see the birds anymore, and then the hawks will move on. It's a temporary solution, but it is very effective, at least temporarily. Cats. This is a controversial topic. I won't get into it too much. I love cats. I have an indoor cat at home, whom I love. But outdoor cats are a big killer of birds. They're such efficient hunters. They kill a lot of birds. So the recommendation is that birds should be kept indoors, safer for them. But they can kill a lot of birds, unfortunately. So really, if outdoor cats are a problem around your bird feeder, you really want to try it's ideal to have the bird feeder in a spot where the cats can't really sneak up on the birds, basically. So if it's a little bit more out in the open, then the birds will have a better chance of not being surprised by a cat stalking them. Disease, we talked a little bit about that before. The key here is, and I know not everybody does this, I probably don't do it as often as I should, but you got to keep your feeders clean. Cleaning the recommendation is to clean your feeder every 2 weeks. it's unrealistic. Realistically, most people don't do that, but it would be great if everybody did. It's just a matter of using hot soapy water, as well as after that, ideally you would follow that up by using a solution of 1 part bleach to 9 parts water, and then
Wow.
let it air dry. That'll really clean any bacteria that might be in there.
Ben, what kind of soap would you recommend?
In terms of the soap, honestly, I think any kind of soap will do. Just make sure,
Dawn dishwashing soap?
yeah, that should be fine. Just, hot soapy water. Just make sure, you rinse it well afterwards and then air dry. But the type of soap, it doesn't really matter. And then also raking underneath the feeders every once in a while is a good thing too, because there can be a lot of built up waste down there that the ground feeders might get, kind of mixed up with. And then the last kind of danger to birds is window strikes. So there are products you can put. So window strikes are when a bird there's a couple ways it happens. One is a bird is just flying and doesn't realize there's a window there and sees a reflection and just thinks it's the sky. This is a problem with office buildings in town a lot. So it's very unfortunate. A lot of birds die that way. So, putting window netting up and is one way to keep the birds from injuring themselves. Now, also birds, if the feeder pole, if you're hanging your feeder from a pole and the feeder is between 3 and 10 feet away from your house, if the bird is from your window, if a bird is startled by something, say a hawk comes out of nowhere and they get startled and they just fly in any direction, the bird, they may fly into the window of your house and injure themselves. So ideally, if you have a pole, you're going to hang that pole either within 3 feet or further than 10 feet away from your house. The reason that's important is if it's within 3 feet, even if they fly right into your window from 3 feet, they haven't built enough momentum up to really do any damage to themselves. And if it's 10 feet away or more, if they start flying towards your window, they have time to right themselves. So they'll see the window and fly away. But the 3 feet to 10 feet is the danger zone. At that point, there's not enough space for them to fly away from the window if they're startled. And they've also potentially built up enough momentum to hurt themselves. So feeder placement is pretty important. But in terms of when the bird doesn't see the window, there's decals and things like that you can put on the window that are made for this purpose so that a bird can see that there's something there and that it's not just empty sky. So now I just wanted to touch on, just before I get to the last section, which will be really quick, bird declines. There was a study that came out, I don't know, it was a year or two ago. It was a very powerful study. Unfortunately, it showed some bad news that since 1970, more than 1 in 4 birds have vanished in North America. That's, I think, about approximately 3 billion less birds. And, that's a big problem. There is some hope. There's some birds species that have done okay in terms of habitat conservation has helped and things like that. But for the most part, most bird species have declined since 1970. But there are some things we can do to help stem this decline. Now, first of all, what's causing the losses? Number one, by far, is habitat loss. That is the number one reason by far. This is when habitat disappears, birds are losing their homes. It occurs when land is converted for agricultural use or new apartment building, what have you, or trees are taken down. And, there's just less places for the birds to live. The number two reason is habitat degradation. That's where the habitat isn't just disappearing outright, but it just becomes less able to support birds. An example of this is like invasive plants or when water quality is compromised. The habitat is just not as suitable for the birds now. So that's a big problem too. That's the number 2 reason. Other reasons that the birds have come down over the last 50 years, cats, like I mentioned, a big reason. There's some estimates that close to 3 billion bird deaths due to cats. Just since 2000, I don't think, I have to check that number, but cats is a big reason. Window strikes is a big reason, hitting cars, industrial collisions. So there's a lot of reasons. And then other threats to the birds. It's hard to really put an exact number to know how many birds are dying from it, but pesticides. Here is an estimate in Canada, 2.7 million bird deaths due to pesticides. Climate warming is an issue. So those are all things that are harming the birds. This is a slide that I found, 7 simple actions to help birds. I think this was put out by the Audubon Society. So avoiding pesticides. I know this chart's a little hard to read. Using native plants. We talked about that a little bit. Keep cats indoors. Try to make the windows safer. Citizen science, that's the thing we were talking about right at the beginning, Operation Feeder Watch, where people can sort of report on the numbers of birds they're seeing. And that helps the scientists learn about the different species. Use less plastic. Another one that I didn't talk about, drink shade-grown coffee. There's a lot of coffee drinkers out there. There are a few brands, a little plug for my store. We sell one of them at my store that actually sell coffee that is bird friendly. And what makes it bird friendly? It was grown on small farms in South America under tree shade. Where there's trees, there's birds. These farms are also on migratory routes, making them particularly important. Where there's no trees, there's no birds. And most coffee, a high percentage of coffee that's used in this country, if you see where it was grown, there's the sun, and then there's the coffee plants. There's nothing in between. So it's been deforested. So I'm drinking coffee that's grown in a sustainable way where it's good for the birds, where under tree shade is good for the birds. So those are all ways that we can help in our own little way. So I know we're a little short on time, but this part I can breeze through. I'm just going to go down now and show you the quote unquote top 20 feeder birds in the New York and Pennsylvania area. And I'm going to start with number 20. And this is just based on these Feeder Watch results over the last, I don't know how many years, about the birds that people have reported seeing most frequently at their feeders. And remember, this list that I'm going to show you is done during the winter. So Project Feeder Watch is basically a cold weather type of study. So keep that in mind. So starting from number 20, going on down, this is number 20, a grackle. A grackle is one of these, a lot of people consider it a nuisance bird. It's an interesting looking bird. It can eat a lot of food, but these are seen a lot in our area. Number 19 is the Carolina wren. Wrens can be hand fed, believe it or not. One of my customers feeds a wren using mealworms. They love mealworms, but they also like suet. Most birds that like insects also like suet. So Carolina wren is number 19. Number 18 is the robin. Now remember, this isn't a group listing of birds that only visit feeders. Robins don't visit feeders that often, but they're seen around feeders a lot on the ground. I don't know about you guys, but I've been seeing a lot of robins just in the last couple of weeks at my house. They love fruit in particular, but they also love their insects. They like their worms too. There's going to be a lot of sparrows on this list, and there's a lot of different types of sparrows. So this is one of them, the white-throated sparrow. Again, sparrows are typically seen most often on the ground, but they'll occasionally go up to feeders as well. Another sparrow, the song sparrow at number 16. A lot of sparrows look very similar, so sometimes it's hard to tell one from the other, but I'm getting better at it. A hairy woodpecker. So there's going to be several woodpeckers that show up on this list. There's another one that's going to come up on the list too, called the downy woodpecker, that looks a lot like the hairy woodpecker. The only difference is the downy woodpecker is a little bit smaller and has a little bit of a shorter beak. You see the red spot on the back of this woodpecker's head? That shows that it's a male. The female looks exactly the same, but has no red spot. And woodpeckers like a lot of different foods, but they're really known for loving suet. The crow. I love this slide, how it says food preferences, meat scraps. I don't think too many people are throwing meat outside, but crows will eat a lot of things. I occasionally get a customer who tells me that the crows are visiting their feeders a little bit.
They chase all the hawks away every day.
Yes, I've heard that too. I don't get them much in my house, but I have heard that. Crows are the smartest bird. Probably a lot of you know that already. Another sparrow, the house sparrow. This is the one that I see the most. I think this is the most common of the sparrows, is the house sparrow. Here's another woodpecker, the red-bellied woodpecker. You see the red on its belly. It's fairly pronounced on this picture. Sometimes it's not as pronounced as this when you see them. There's another woodpecker called a red, some people ask me, why isn't this called a red-headed woodpecker? There is another woodpecker called the red-headed woodpecker, but its entire head and face are red. So it's even redder than this one. So I think that's why they call this the red-bellied woodpecker instead. But it's a beautiful bird. Fairly common. I see them at my feeder, not as often as the other woodpeckers, but once in a while. Very, very, very beautiful. Starling. Starling, a lot of people, this is to a lot of people the #1 nuisance birds, but not to everybody. Some people like them. They're an interesting looking bird. They're very noisy. They're very, very loud. They'll often come in a large flock and almost take over a feeder. They're here all year round, but there are times of the year where they're more prevalent than other times. And they don't like safflower. So if you're ever having a starling problem, getting too many starlings, maybe put a feeder out that just has safflower in it. I guarantee you the starlings will not be interested in that, but cardinals will. Oh, a nuthatch. I think I mentioned the nuthatch before. One of my favorite birds. They're very interesting to look at. They often are eating they upside down. They'll walk down a tree upside down. Very interesting birds. They also, I've noticed the ones at my feeder, sometimes they try and intimidate another bird that's getting too close to them by opening their wings, but I've never seen another bird really get scared by that. So it's kind of adorable when I see them do that. They try, but it doesn't seem to do much. But they're a lot of people like nuthatches. They're an interesting bird. Titmouse. This actually is my favorite bird. I can't really explain why. I just like the way it looks, but titmice are really nice birds. You'll often see a titmouse when you see a chickadee. They flock together very often. House finch, very common bird. This comes in at #8. The males have red on them, like on the chest and like on the face. So that's a male on the left. The females are a little more boring looking, I would say. They don't have red on them, but house finches are very common. They look a lot, the females look a lot like sparrows, but they're not. Here's the goldfinch. There is the summer male. But in the non-summer, that's what they look like on the left. That's what the females look like all the time, and that's what the males look like on the left. Still a pretty bird, kind of an olive color. But they like 2 types of food. They like Niger seed and they like sunflower seed. Blue jay. So blue jays, they're very loud. You've probably all heard of blue jays' sort of piercing call. Some people consider blue jays bully birds. They can be a little bit aggressive. I don't know. I haven't really seen them bother other birds. I like them. They're very pretty, but they are big birds, and they're kind of like a bull in a china shop. They'll come to a feeder, and a lot of the other birds will scatter sometimes because they're so big. They really love peanut. They like a lot of foods, but they really do love peanuts in particular. A lot of times peanuts in the shell. Here's that downy woodpecker I mentioned before. It looks very similar to the hairy woodpecker, just a little bit smaller. And this is a male because it's got the red on the back of its head. Oh, we're getting closer to #1. Here's the cardinal. So the male is red. The female is very pretty also, kind of a chestnut color, I would say, or golden color, maybe something like that. They're naturally ground feeders, but they'll go to a feeder. They also are most often seen at a feeder first thing in the morning, and then just before it gets dark. So a lot of people say they're the first bird at the feeder and the last to leave. The theory is that since they're so bright looking, they like to keep a low profile when the day is not as bright. So they'll be out in the open. They'll be at the feeder more in the morning and as it's starting to get closer to dusk. Chickadee, a chickadee is a fairly tame bird. I've seen people hand feed chickadees as well. They're cute, but very cute birds. They're often flocking together with titmice. #2 is the mourning dove. This is mainly a ground feeder. They'll try and get to a regular feeder, but they just have trouble landing on most feeders because they're so kind of big and cumbersome. And #1, anybody have any ideas what #1 is? And the clue or the hint is that this is a winter list. Anybody? All right. It's the junco. So junco is a bird that we only see here in the winter. It comes here because of our warm winters. They're from Canada. They fly here for the warmer winters. They're a pretty bird, kind of a slate color. They're sort of white on the bottom, and you'll usually see them 99% of the time they're on the ground. They're ground feeding birds. So that's the junco. That's the number one reported bird seen at feeders in the New York, Pennsylvania area, in the winter, according to Project Feeder Watch. So that's a quick summary of the more common types of birds that we see at the feeders. And there we go. Thank you. Are there any questions? Complaints? Comments?
I'm gonna
Thank
say we-
you.
Yeah, we had some comments if you want to just read the chats.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. I haven't been looking
yeah.
at the chats.
No, you've been covering things, a lot of comments rather than questions. So if you want to
Okay.
just,
Oh, is it this?
yeah, someone did something with
Oh,
the
there we go.
suet and they did an experiment. Apparently blueberries wasn't helpful. They didn't like that more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Someone, and I think you covered a best way to clean, like what to use to clean the bird houses, right?
Okay. Yeah. Bird feeders or bird houses, hot soapy water plus
Yeah.
a 1 part bleach to 9 parts water solution, but then make sure you rinse it out and air dry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't reading these chats as we were
No,
going along. I'm a
it's
little
okay.
technologically challenged. Let
It
me
was a
just
lot, it was a lot of comments and then they were commenting to everyone. So
Okay.
it was interesting for everyone.
Okay. All right.
So I don't know if anyone else has another question for Ben. If you do, you could just unmute yourself and maybe ask him now.
And you had a list of the, positive things that bird feeding does for people's health. Any way you could send that list out, that would be great.
Oh, sure.
Sure. I mean,
There's a
Ben,
bunch of links there, yeah.
yeah, if you send it to me, I could send it to everyone who registered. I could also send everyone a recording of this.
Mhm.
And if you have another question, you could feel free to email me, or better yet, stop into Wild Birds Unlimited and then go right to the source, because I'll have to go to the source anyhow, because I'm not going to know the answer. Yeah, so
sounds great.
thank you.
Oh,
I
you're
think,
welcome. I was just looking at any other but yeah, I guess hopefully we covered everything on the
yeah, I'm
comments.
looking
Yeah,
to see
so.
if there's anything.
So Ben, what time is your store open?
Oh, so we open at 10 o'clock Monday through Saturday. We open at 11 o'clock on Sunday. So we're open 10 to 5 Monday through Saturday and 11 to 4 on Sunday.
Good job, Ben. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Enjoy your night. Thank you,
Thanks,
Ben.
everybody.
Yep,
Great
very
night.
informative.
Sure,
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
That was great.
Uh-huh.
Honey, I'm glad you signed us up.
Yes.